Hi class, welcome to lecture 6.1 on the weighted average cost of capital, or also known as the WACC. This is going to be chapter 10 in your book, and you can find all of the problems that will be on the exam actually on your test guide, not from this lecture. This lecture will conceptually go over the WACC, but I'm not going to ask you any conceptual questions. Being the last exam, I'm going to go a little easy on you. This is really just here for you to understand the WACC a little bit better and maybe help you understand some of those math problems a little bit better. But for the most part, what you're responsible for exam 6 is going to be on the test guide, so keep that in mind. Now, let's get the party started. Once again, this is from chapter 10. There's a shirt right there says the WACC is whack. I think that might very much be true because it brings this whole class full circle. A lot of the different concepts that you've learned from other exams, whether it be how to calculate the value of a bond or the value of a stock, or whether you're talking about the CAPM or the dividend growth model, or talking about some ratios like debt to equity, all of that stuff that you learned from other exams, it's all going to come full circle here, and I think it's going to really help you understand why we waited to the end to figure out a WACC. And remember, there is a math procedure here. Now, could these numbers be fudged one way or the other a little bit? Sure, they can, and I'll even talk to you about how to make an adjustment to the WACC. But I just wanted to show you that everything that we talked about, including the required rate of return that companies use, it's all based on sound math principles. And so we're going to talk about those principles for figuring out that weighted average cost of capital, or that company's required return, right now. Let's first talk about what kind of information are you going to use. Well, it's going to have pretty much 3 different areas. If you used to play Zelda growing up, you heard about the Triforce or whatnot, the 3 different parts of the triangle that make a bigger triangle. Well, it's kind of this idea here too. It's like a pizza pie divided up in 3 ways between debt, equity, and sometimes preferred stock. But that being said, preferred stock is usually a very small percentage, and oftentimes, at least in a lot of the problems we'll work, common equity will be your biggest source, right? You wouldn't want a company to be mainly financed with debt unless this company had wonderful growth prospects, about to develop right down the road. But nonetheless, those are the 3 parts, and with common equity, sometimes you may see that broken up as retained earnings and new common stock, but I'm not going to worry about that too much on the exam. I'm just going to focus on long-term debt or debt, preferred stock, and common equity or common stock. Now let's talk about the major equation here. So the weighted average cost of capital is going to be 3 different weights here, and I like to use E for equity, but they're going to use, the book uses here C for common stock. And so you're going to see 3 different W's. There's the weights for common stock or equity, the weights for preferred stock, and the book may use actually just a P for preferred stock, times the weight of debt. Okay? And then they're going to see these R's. These R's are known as cost, so like the cost of preferred stock, the cost of debt, and the cost of common stock. Now the book likes to use an S here as well for cost of common stock, but I'm going to use an E. So I've changed all of these to where they look like what it would look like on my test. So I just want to let you know that, be a little bit flexible if you're reading in the book and seeing that my notation is a little bit different. The math is essentially the exact same thing. Okay, but the main thing to remember here is that the W's are going to refer to the weights, and the R's are going to refer to the different costs that you're going to calculate for each one of these different pieces of the overall company's value. Now, if you remember that in the third value there, that with the weight of debt times the cost of debt, there was a 1 minus T. That's because we're going to use after-tax cost here, and that's simply just because shareholders focus on after-tax. So we're going to make that small adjustment there. And the reason for that is because with debt, you got to remember you get a little bit of an interest tax shield, so the interest is going to be tax deductible. That's the reason that you'll see the 1 minus T there when you're trying to figure out the debt component of the WACC. Okay, class, we're going to go over one problem like a problem you'll see on your test guide. If you take a look here at the overview of Coleman Technologies Incorporated, you're going to see that it's got a tax rate of 40%. You're going to see some information for common stock that we're going to use to get what's known as the cost of equity. Some stuff for the return on the market. We're going to use that also, the beta and the risk-free rate and the RA. That's all information you'll also use to get the cost of equity using the CAPM. then we got some information there for preferred stock, and it's going to tell you, what the percentage is, and so that you can get a dividend payment on that. Just remember with preferred stock that its par value is $100 a share, not like it is with bonds. Bonds par value is what? And remember, if you can remember from exam 3, you'll know that the par value for a bond is $1,000. Okay, and then that last bullet point there gives you some information on bonds, and we're going to use that to get the cost of debt. So we're trying to get three things here: the cost of equity, the cost of preferred stock, and the cost of debt. Now you can see where the cost of equity is in the equation. It's the R with a subscript E. Okay, now what is it? The cost of equity is the return required by equity investors given the risk of the cash flows from the firm. Okay, so basically it's going to be the return you expect to get from stocks, specifically the common stock for the firm. And there's going to be two different ways we're going to do this. One is the dividend growth model, and the other is the CAPM. Now, since there are two ways to determine the cost of equity, you really need to make sure you know how to do both the CAPM and the dividend growth model. Now, you've seen both of these before on previous exams, so I don't think that this is going to be too hard. If you remember, the CAPM is going to be the expected return, or in this case, the cost of equity, which is R subscript E. Okay, and that's going to be equal to the risk-free rate plus beta times the, in parentheses, return on the market minus the risk-free rate, which is that risk premium that we talk about sometimes. Okay, and then you got the dividend growth model. If you remember, that's basically that price, or current price, is equal to D1 over R minus G, where you can rearrange that for R, and in this case that R would be your R subscript E, or your cost of equity, and that's going to, remember, that would be equal to the dividend yield plus the capital gains yield. So this, in this case, you've got D1 over P0 plus G. Okay, so let's go ahead and figure it out with the CAPM first. All you're going to have to do is plug in 7% for the risk-free. I know it's high, but that's the number that they gave us here for the risk-free rate. And then the return on the market is 6%, or I should say the risk premium is, after you take the return on the market of 13% minus the risk-free rate of 7%, you're left with the 6%. Okay, and multiply that times your beta of 1.2, and you're going to get 14.2%. So that doesn't mean, though, that that is your only cost of equity. You can also figure this out using the dividend growth model. You take a look here, you know that D0 is 4.19, where you can figure out D1, remember, by just using time value money and pushing that forward a year, right? So that's just D0 times 1 plus G is going to equal to D1. So you can figure out that your D1 is $4 and basically 40 cents. And then now you can plug it into the equation, right? So your cost of equity is going to be the dividend yield, or D1 over P0, plus the capital gains yield, which we know is G. So you got $4.40 over $50 plus another nickel, and you're going to, or I should say another 5% really. And so you're going to have 13.8%. So now to find the actual cost of equity, what you're going to want to find is an average. Okay, you've got, the range is going to be somewhere between 13.8 and 14.2%. So we might as well take, and that's what I'd want you to do on the exam. Okay, now there are some other ways to do this too, but I'm not going to teach them for this class. These are the two main ways, and this is what I want you to focus on: the CAPM and the dividend growth model. You got both. You take an average. So we're going to use 14% in this case. In real life, though, you may weight one way more or the other, depending on which one you like best, right? A good example might be if you're not real sure about the dividends for a company, you may want to rely more on the CAPM. Or if you're not real sure about the beta for a company, you may want to rely more on the dividend growth model. Now that we know our cost of equity is 14%, let's look at our cost of preferred stock. It's going to be R with a little subscript PS, okay? So what do we know about preferred stock? Preferred stock pays a constant dividend every period. Its dividends are expected to be paid forever, so it's kind of like a perpetuity, right? Well, it's going to be real easy to figure out in this situation. All you're going to want to do is put the dividend over the price, okay? Because remember, with a perpetuity, you can rearrange that perpetuity equation to where the return is just the cash flow over the price. In this case, it's the dividend. So we're just looking for whatever the dividend is over the price. So as you can see here, we just took the $10 dividend. And how did I get that $10 dividend? Well, That is just 10% of par, and 10% of par for preferred stock is 10% of $100, which is 10. Okay, and once again, price for the preferred stock here is going to be $111.10. So that just gives you 9%. It's that easy, folks. Your cost for preferred stock is going to be 9%. Okay, now that we know that the cost of equity is 14% and the cost of preferred stock is 9%, let's look at cost of debt. Now the cost of debt is just the required return on a company's debt. Okay, there's a couple ways of doing this. One is you can compute the yield to maturity on existing debt, or you can go out there and find the actual current rates based on the bond rating expected on new debt. Okay, just remember though that the cost of debt is not the coupon rate. Now, what does all that mean? Well, basically for this class, we're going to, once again, all we're really going to do here though is figure out how to get the cost of debt using the time value money buttons on our calculator, which is essentially just computing the yield to maturity on existing debt. Okay? Now we're also going to have to adjust this because, as you remember, interest is tax deductible, creates a tax shield. So that's why you also see the 1 minus T after the R subscript D. Now in this case, you'll see that we're going to put something in for all the buttons except for I. It's a 15-year bond. Okay, so that's going to be 30 semi-annual payment periods. The present value is going to be the negative price. Payment is going to be one semi-annual coupon bond, so that's $120 divided by 2, which is 60. Future value is always 1,000. You saw for I, you're going to end up with a semi-annual yield to maturity of 5%, but remember, we want the annual yield to maturity, especially if we're going to get the annual cost of debt here, which is what we're looking for. So the annual cost of debt is going to be 10%. So it's that simple, folks. One-time value money problem, and you've got now the cost of debt. Don't forget, though, you can make this what we call the after-tax cost of debt, and you can do that simply by multiplying that by 1 minus T. In that case, this would then be 6%. If you plug them all up into the equation, it looks a whole lot like this formula I've got right here. You're going to have the weight of equity at 60% times the cost of equity at 14%, plus the weight of preferred stock at 10% times the cost of preferred stock at 9%, plus the weight of debt at 30% times the cost of debt at 10% times 1 minus T, which is 60%. You plug all that together, you get 8.4% plus 0.9% plus 1.8%, which gives you a WACC, or weighted average cost of capital, for this firm at 11.1%. Okay, so that's how you do the WACC. The mystery solved, right? And there is a lot involved, and maybe that's why they say the WACC is whacked. But what we need to do is also remember that this is just for a firm, and a company can adjust this as well. So let me just take a real quick moment to explain that. All right, class. Should the company use the company WACC for every one of its projects? The answer there really is no, because some projects are actually going to be riskier than what the company is used to, and some will be safer. Now, if the project is riskier than the company is used to, they may add like 1, 2, 3%, whatever, to the WACC. And if the project is safer, they may actually take some off from the WACC, right? Now, it's important to understand that because different projects have different risks, and so sometimes you may have to adjust this. The math becomes a little bit shaky here as to how you do this. There's probably not really a mathematical formula so much for deciding how to do this. On the test guide, I'm just going to tell you, I'm just going to say add 2% or subtract 3%, something like that, okay? And then finally, what we have here is just a little slide. A little slide that's going to show you that if you keep the same WACC for every project, you might end up accepting projects that you should reject and rejecting projects that you should accept because you didn't adjust the WACC based on the risk involved for the project. So for example, here you'll see Project L. Now Project L has a rate of return that is underneath the company's WACC, but it is above the division's WACC, or at least Division L's WACC, meaning that Division L doesn't take as much risk. So then, 9% is above 7%, so you would accept that project, although just using the company's WACC would have had you actually reject it. If you look at Project H, you'll see that it is above the company's WACC, so you would normally accept it, except Division H takes a lot of risk, right? So you'd want to use a higher WACC there, and what you're going to find out now is that the project at 11% comes 2% underneath that division's WACC, so you would actually reject that. So, you can make adjustments to these numbers as well, and I think it's important to understand that. But in general, I hope that you have seen how the weighted average cost of capital brings together the whole class, and it really teaches you how to use all the different tools that you've learned in the class. And I hope you have enjoyed this class. This concludes lecture 6.1.